July 25th, 1965. The Newport Folk Festival. For the past 2 years, this idyllic gathering in Rhode Island, held in the picturesque setting of Freebody Park, near the opulent mansions of Newport's elite, has been the undisputed heartland of the American folk music revival. A place of pilgrimage for earnest college students and seasoned troubadours alike. It is more than a festival. It is a church, a sacred ground where the gospel of authenticity, tradition, and social justice is preached from acoustic stages. This was a community bound by shared ideals, a belief in the power of song to illuminate truth and inspire change, often looking back to Depression-era struggles and Appalachian hollows for its sonic and ethical compass. It was a movement fueled by a rejection of post-war materialism, suburban conformity, and the perceived hollowness of mainstream American culture. It yearned for something real, something rooted in the soil and the soul of America, often romanticizing a pre-industrial past free from corporate influence. The air at Newport hummed with a sense of righteous purpose, a feeling that this music, these people, were on the right side of history, fighting the good fight against war, racism, and inequality. Workshops during the day featured intense discussions on banjo techniques alongside debates about the Vietnam War, which was rapidly escalating under President Johnson, or voter registration drives in the Deep South, fresh off the violence of Freedom Summer the year before. Civil rights activists like the Freedom Singers shared stages with performers, blurring the line between art and activism, creating a palpable sense of a movement on the march. And its undisputed prophet, its young messiah, the one whose words seem to perfectly capture the turbulent spirit of the age, is a 24-year-old from Minnesota named Bob Dylan. Just 2 nights earlier, Dylan had held court at an afternoon workshop, charming the faithful with his familiar Martin acoustic guitar and harmonica rack, the reluctant voice of a generation. He played old songs, bantered playfully, answered questions with playful obfuscation, embodying the image they expected, the scruffy troubadour, the inheritor of Woody Guthrie's mantle. This workshop performance served as a calming balm, reassuring the assembled congregation that despite the unsettling electric sounds creeping onto his records, despite the rumors swirling around his recent pop chart success, their Bob was still fundamentally one of them, committed to the acoustic purity the festival championed. But tonight is different. Tonight, something is crackling in the air, a nervous energy, a sense of an impending storm. Rumors had perhaps circulated about his new electric direction, fueled by the controversial single Like a Rolling Stone, climbing the pop charts even as the festival unfolded. A 6-minute epic spat out onto AM radio, an anomaly amidst the 2-minute love songs, a sneering indictment that felt miles away from the communal uplift of Blowin' in the Wind. As Dylan walks onto the main stage, the sun beginning to set, the crowd roars in anticipation. This is the moment they've waited for, the culmination of the weekend, the word from their chosen oracle. But then they see it. Slung over his shoulder is not the familiar acoustic. It is a Fender Stratocaster, a solid-body electric guitar, likely the Sunburst model he'd recently acquired, gleaming under the stage lights like an alien artifact, a symbol of everything the folk purists disdained. Commercialism, volume, rock and roll decadence. Behind him stands not a lone accompanist, but a full, amplified rock and roll band, composed mostly of members from the loud, urban Paul Butterfield Blues Band, musicians steeped in Chicago blues, not Appalachian ballads. The first notes ring out, loud, distorted, aggressive. It's the opening riff of Maggie's Farm, a sneering, defiant blues stomp. The sound hits the crowd like a physical blow, It's not just electric, it's loud, far louder than anything typically heard on the Newport main stage, which usually favored subtle amplification, if any. Mike Bloomfield's guitar cuts through the air with a raw, trebly edge completely foreign to the warm tones of acoustic instruments. The delicate balance, the intimacy prized by the folk community, is shattered. A wave of confusion ripples through the tens of thousands gathered on the grass. Young men in button-down shirts, young women in simple dresses, people who came for poetry and quiet contemplation, for the shared intimacy of acoustic music under the stars. Then comes the reaction. A cacophony erupts. Cheers from a younger, perhaps more rock-oriented faction mix with stunned silence. But quickly, another sound grows louder, more insistent. Boos. Angry, confused, betrayed shouts from the very people who had crowned him, their king, just a year before. Accusations fly through the air. Sellout. Traitor. Judas. Go back to the Sullivan Show. Play folk music. This single performance, lasting barely 15 minutes, would become one of the most mythologized, debated, and pivotal moments in 20th century music. It was the sound of a cultural civil war erupting in real time. It was the moment the quiet, collective earnestness of the folk movement crashed headlong into the loud, personal, and ambiguous rebellion of rock and roll. It was the day Bob Dylan, the acoustic prophet, committed a public act of heresy, shattering the folk dream into a million electric pieces. But this act of perceived betrayal was also an act of radical creation. By plugging in, Dylan wasn't just killing the past, he was birthing the future. This is the story of that cultural flashpoint, the betrayal at Newport, the day Bob Dylan blew up the folk revival, and in doing so, paved the way for everything that came next. This is the story of folk music's funeral and rock and roll's explosive rebirth. To comprehend the depth of the betrayal felt that night, one must first understand the sacred tenets of the folk revival that Dylan seemingly desecrated. The movement, which blossomed in the late 1950s and reached its zenith in the early 1960s, was far more than just a musical genre. It was a moral crusade. Its roots lay in the work of folklorists like Alan Lomax, whose field recordings preserved centuries of American and global musical traditions, literally capturing the voices of sharecroppers, prisoners, and cowboys before they vanished. And musicians like Woody Guthrie, the Dust Bowl balladeer whose guitar famously proclaimed, "This machine kills fascists," embodying the artist as activist, a man whose life and songs were inseparable from the struggles of working people. His rambling, plain-spoken style became a touchstone. And Pete Seeger, the banjo-playing patriarch who saw folk song as a tool for social change and community building, leading sing-alongs that turned audiences into participants, embodying the movement's communal ethos. They saw folk music as the authentic voice of the common people. Farmers, miners, union organizers, prisoners, marginalized communities. It was a repository of history, struggle, and collective wisdom. Music passed down through generations, untainted by Tin Pan Alley or corporate interests. It held an almost sacred status as the unvarnished truth, the opposite of manufactured pop. This search for authenticity extended beyond the music itself, influencing fashion, simple work clothes, denim, eschewing slick suits, language, adopting vernacular phrases, and even political affiliations, often aligning with progressive, sometimes socialist ideals. In the conformist Cold War climate of the 1950s, folk music became a coded language of dissent. Pete Seeger and the Weavers faced blacklisting for their leftist politics, driven from mainstream radio and television during the McCarthy era, their careers nearly destroyed for singing songs about peace and unions. This persecution only burnished the movement's credentials as a voice of opposition, lending it an air of righteous martyrdom. Yet, the music persisted, finding a new audience on college campuses among young people searching for something more meaningful than the manufactured pop tunes dominating the airwaves. Groups like the Kingston Trio brought folk into the mainstream in the late 50s, scoring massive hits with songs like Tom Dooley, albeit in a polished, palatable, often depoliticized form. Their success created a commercial boom, the folk craze opening the door for countless imitators and inspiring a generation to pick up acoustic guitars. This commercial success, however, created a tension within the movement between the purists, who valued traditional authenticity above all else, often debating the correct way to perform centuries-old ballads, down to the specific dialect or instrumentation, and those who saw adapting the music as a way to reach a wider audience. But the heart of the movement beat in the coffee houses of Greenwich Village, like Gerd's Folk City, the Gaslight Café, and Cambridge, like Club 47, where young musicians armed with acoustic guitars sang traditional ballads, blues laments, and increasingly, newly written songs addressing the urgent issues of the day: civil rights, nuclear disarmament, poverty. Figures like Joan Baez, with her crystalline soprano and unwavering commitment to social justice, became icons, embodying the movement's blend of artistic purity and political engagement. She was often referred to as the Queen of Folk. Others like Phil Ochs wrote biting topical songs ripped straight from the headlines, while Tom Paxton offered gentler, more humanistic observations. The folk revival was built on a foundation of perceived purity. Acoustic instruments, the guitar, the banjo, the autoharp, the upright bass, were deemed honest, direct, and uncorrupted by commercialism. They were the instruments of the people, playable anywhere, requiring no amplification, fostering intimacy between performer and listener. Electric instruments, particularly the electric guitar, were seen as symbols of the crass, commercialized world of rock and roll, a genre folk purists often dismissed as trivial, juvenile, artistically bankrupt, and tainted by corporate greed. Rock and roll was loud, simplistic, aimed at teenagers, and often focused on frivolous topics like cars and dating. Folk music was nuanced, literate, rooted in history, and aimed at changing the world. Rock and roll was for dancing. Folk music was for thinking. The lyrics were paramount. Songs were meant to say something, to carry a message, preferably one of social significance. Clarity was valued above ambiguity. The message should be direct, understandable. Community was essential. The ideal was the hootenanny, a gathering where everyone sang together, often joining hands for rousing renditions of "We Shall Overcome," blurring the line between performer and audience, reinforcing a sense of collective purpose and shared struggle. The Newport Folk Festival, established in 1959 by figures including Pete Seeger, George Wein, and Theodore Bickle, quickly became the movement's spiritual center. It was conceived as an antidote to the commercialism of events like the Newport Jazz Festival, also run by Wein. It was nonprofit, artistically curated, and deeply committed to presenting a wide spectrum of traditional and contemporary folk music. Appalachian fiddlers like Gene Ritchie, alongside urban songwriters like Phil Ochs, Delta bluesmen like Son House next to topical balladeers like Tom Paxton. Newport was where legends were rediscovered, like Mississippi John Hurt, brought back from obscurity after decades and hailed as a living link to the past, and new voices were anointed. It was a place where earnest discussions about politics and authenticity were as important as the music itself, held in afternoon workshops under tents. It was the high church of folk, and its congregation was devout. Into this idealistic, often rigid world walked Robert Zimmerman, a young Jewish kid from Hibbing, Minnesota, who arrived in Greenwich Village in the 1960s winter of 1961, having renamed himself Bob Dylan after the poet Dylan Thomas. He was a whirlwind of raw talent, ambition, and carefully constructed mythology. He presented himself as a disciple of Woody Guthrie, visiting the ailing folk legend in the hospital, absorbing his songs and his Dust Bowl persona, even affecting a Guthrie-esque drawl. He spun tales of hopping freight trains and traveling with carnivals, crafting an image of a weathered traveler, though his actual background was comfortably middle class. Dylan's early performances were electrifying. He wasn't polished. His voice was nasal and unconventional, his harmonica playing raw and sometimes abrasive, but he possessed an undeniable charisma and an astonishing ability to channel the spirits of old folk and blues traditions while simultaneously sounding utterly contemporary. He seemed to have absorbed the entire history of American folk music and was now spitting it back out, transformed. His first album, Bob Dylan, 1962, produced by the legendary John Hammond at Columbia Records, who had also discovered Billie Holiday and Bessie Smith, consisted mainly of traditional folk and blues covers, learned from fellow village performers like Dave Van Ronk. It sold poorly, reportedly only 5,000 copies in its first year, but established him within the scene as a compelling interpreter. It was his second album, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, 1963, that changed everything. Packed with instantly iconic original songs like Blowin' in the Wind, Masters of War, a scathing indictment of the military-industrial complex, A Hard Rain's A Gonna Fall, a surreal, apocalyptic vision inspired by the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, a surprisingly modern take on a breakup. The album became the defining soundtrack for a generation grappling with profound anxieties and a burgeoning desire for change. Blowin' in the Wind, in particular, became an anthem. Its simple, profound questions resonated globally. Covered and popularized by Peter, Paul, and Mary, whose version hit number 2 on the charts, it cemented Dylan's status as the leading voice of the protest movement. He was hailed as a prophet, a seer, the conscience of his generation, labels he would quickly come to despise, feeling they were a heavy, inaccurate burden. His performance at the 1963 Newport Folk Festival, where he sang alongside Joan Baez, who was instrumental in championing him and bringing him on stage, their voices intertwining beautifully. Pete Seeger, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and others at the March on Washington finale of We Shall Overcome, was his coronation. He was the undisputed king of folk. His next album, The Times They Are A-Changin', 1964, doubled down on the protest persona with stark, topical songs addressing poverty, only a pawn in their game. Racism, the lonesome death of Hattie Carroll, and generational conflict, with God on our side. The title track was an explicit warning to the old guard. Your old road is rapidly a gin. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand. For the times they are a-changin'. His appearance at Newport in 1964 was met with near religious fervor. He was the man with the answers, the acoustic warrior leading the charge against injustice. But beneath the surface, Dylan was already growing restless. He chafed under the weight of expectation. He felt confined by the protest singer label, finding it simplistic and limiting. He famously snapped at reporters who tried to categorize him, saying, "I don't write finger-pointing songs, I write songs." He was absorbing new influences, the surreal poetry of Rimbaud and the French symbolists, The beat writers like Kerouac and Ginsberg, whose stream of consciousness style began to infect his lyrics. The electric blues booming out of Chicago, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and crucially, the joyous, revolutionary sound of the Beatles, who had exploded onto the American scene in 1964. Dylan was fascinated by their energy, their wit, their sonic power, and their complex chord changes, a sophistication missing from much folk music. He famously met them in a New York hotel room in August 1964, allegedly introducing them to marijuana, but more importantly, engaging in a mutual artistic exchange that would profoundly shape both their careers. He encouraged them to write more meaningful lyrics, while they inspired him with their sonic adventurousness. He saw in their music a freedom and an experimentalism that was missing in the often dogmatic folk scene. He was also reportedly struck by the Animals' electric, bluesy version of the traditional folk song House of the Rising Sun, which became a huge hit, proof that tradition could be electrified and reach a mass audience without sacrificing its power. Dylan's artistic evolution began to surface on his next album, Another Side of Bob Dylan, released later in 1964. While still acoustic, the songs were intensely personal, introspective, and often surreal, moving away from overt political statements towards explorations of relationships. It, Ain't Me Babe, and Internal Landscapes, Chimes of Freedom. Songs like My Back Pages explicitly renounced his earlier certainty. Ah, but I was so much older then. I'm younger than that now. The folk purists were already nervous. Was their prophet losing the faith? Was he becoming self-absorbed? Where were the calls to action? The real earthquake came in March 1965 with the release of the single Subterranean Homesick Blues. It was unlike anything Dylan had done before. It was electric, chaotic, a torrent of stream of consciousness lyrics spat out over a clattering rock and roll beat. It sounded like Chuck Berry on speed, channeling the beat poets. Johnny's in the basement mixing up the medicine. I'm on the pavement thinking about the government. It even came with a promotional film clip, a precursor to music videos, featuring Dylan flipping cue cards with fragmented lyrics, a gesture of playful defiance against interpretation. The song cracked the top 40, his first real pop hit, but it horrified many in the folk establishment. Sing Out magazine, the Bible of the folk movement, published scathing criticisms, accusing Dylan of betraying his roots and succumbing to commercialism. Erwin Silber, the editor, wrote a famous open letter lamenting Dylan's turn towards the world of pop music, where integration is measured in cash, accusing him of losing touch with the people. The album that followed, Bringing It All Back Home, released just days later, was even more divisive. Side 1 was electric, featuring Subterranean Homesick Blues and other amplified tracks like Maggie's Farm and Outlaw Blues. Side 2 was acoustic, featuring masterpieces like Mr. Tambourine Man and It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. The album was a declaration of independence, a statement that Dylan would not be confined by any genre or expectation. Tom Wilson, who produced the electric side, brought in blues rock musicians, creating a raw, ragged sound that was a world away from the polished folk rock the Byrds were simultaneously crafting with their cover of Mr. Tambourine Man, which hit #1 in June '65. Dylan's electric sound was dirtier, more dangerous, less concerned with pleasing harmonies, and more focused on raw energy. Then, just weeks before Newport, came Like a Rolling Stone, recorded in June 1965. Its 6-minute length, swirling organ riff played by Al Kooper, who famously bluffed his way onto the session, and vitriolic lyrics. How does it feel to be on your own, with no direction home, like a complete unknown / like a rolling stone ? broke every rule of pop radio. Yet it became a massive hit, signaling that the audience was ready for something new, even if the folk establishment wasn't. This was the context leading into the Newport Folk Festival in July 1965. Dylan arrived not as the humble folk prophet of previous years, but as a burgeoning rock star, albeit one still deeply connected to the festival's history. The tension was palpable. Would he play his new electric material? Would he appease the folk guardians? The festival organizers themselves seemed unsure, scheduling him for both an acoustic workshop and the prime Sunday evening slot. On Saturday afternoon, July 24th, Dylan performed at an acoustic workshop. He played traditional folk songs, charmed the audience, and seemed to reaffirm his connection to the movement's roots. He played "All I Really Want to Do," a song from another side, signaling his shift towards personal themes, but delivered it acoustically, safely within the established boundaries. This performance likely acted as a strategic head fake, lulling the purists into a false sense of security. They believed their Bob was still one of them. Behind the scenes, however, a different plan was brewing. Dylan had decided he wanted to perform his electric material on the main stage Sunday night. He hastily assembled a backing band, pulling musicians from the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, who had already scandalized some attendees with their loud, amplified blues set earlier in the festival, featuring the blistering guitar work of Mike Bloomfield. The lineup included Bloomfield, whose virtuosic, stinging blues licks were the antithesis of folk fingerpicking, bassist Jerome Arnold, drummer Sam Lay, and keyboardists Al Cooper, who had famously improvised the organ riff on "Like a Rolling Stone" just weeks earlier, and Barry Goldberg, though Goldberg didn't end up playing in the electric set due to confusion. They had minimal rehearsal time, reportedly running through the songs late Saturday night in a nearby mansion. This lack of rehearsal would contribute to the raw, perhaps chaotic sound of the performance. Sunday, July 25th, 1965. The air was thick with anticipation as Dylan prepared to take the stage for his headlining set. Festival organizer Peter Yarrow introduced him, perhaps sensing the potential for controversy, emphasizing Dylan's enduring connection to folk tradition. Then Dylan walked out, followed by the band. He strapped on the Stratocaster. The sound that erupted was alien to Newport. It was loud. Bloomfield's guitar screamed. Arnold and Lay's rhythm section pounded with a force rarely heard on these grounds. Dylan, clad in a black leather jacket and sunglasses despite the evening hour, looking like a different species from the denim-clad folkies, snarled the lyrics to Maggie's Farm, his anti-authoritarian anthem that now sounded less like a folk protest and more like a punk rock declaration. "I ain't gonna work on Maggie's farm no more." The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. Some cheered, recognizing the power and excitement of the new sound, perhaps younger fans already embracing the rock revolution, thrilled by the sheer audacity. But a significant portion of the crowd, particularly the older folk veterans and the purist contingent, felt betrayed. The boos began almost immediately, a wave of anger washing over the stage. How could he do this? Here? On this sacred ground? It felt like a desecration, a violation of trust. The band launched into "Like a Rolling Stone," Dylan's epic 6-minute single that was currently climbing the pop charts. It was a song of scorn and empathy, a complex masterpiece that defied easy categorization. But at Newport, its length, its volume, and its electric arrangement were perceived as an assault. The sound mix was reportedly terrible, muddy, and distorted, making it difficult to even hear Dylan's vocals, further infuriating those who believed the words were paramount. This technical failure only amplified the sense of artistic betrayal. If you couldn't hear the words, what was the point? Accounts of what happened next vary wildly, becoming part of the enduring mythology. Pete Seeger, the patriarch of the folk movement and a Newport board member, was allegedly apoplectic backstage. Some reports claim he was furious about the distorted sound quality, others that he was outraged by the betrayal of folk principles. Legend has it he either threatened to cut the power cables with an axe or said, "If I had an axe, I'd cut the cables." Seeger himself later clarified he was primarily upset that the lyrics were unintelligible due to the poor sound, stating, "Get that distortion out of his voice. It's terrible." He felt the message, the core of folk music, was being lost in the noise. Meanwhile, a confrontation reportedly occurred between Dylan's famously aggressive manager, Albert Grossman, and the festival organizers, including folklorist Alan Lomax, who represented the traditionalist wing. Shouting matches ensued. Theories abound. Was the set cut short due to the hostility? Was it always planned to be only 3 songs? Was the sound deliberately sabotaged? The truth remains shrouded in conflicting memories and agendas. What is clear is that the performance felt truncated, abrupt, unfinished. The band played one more electric song, Phantom Engineer, an early version of "It Takes a Lot to Laugh, It Takes a Train to Cry." After roughly 15 chaotic minutes, they abruptly left the stage, leaving the audience stunned and divided. The boos rained down, master of ceremonies. Peter Yarrow, attempting damage control, pleaded with Dylan to return. According to legend, Dylan was shaken backstage, perhaps even tearful, the intensity of the negative reaction catching him off guard. Yarrow eventually coaxed him back on stage, alone, armed only with an acoustic guitar borrowed from Johnny Cash. The crowd quieted, perhaps anticipating an apology or a return to form. Dylan, looking vulnerable but resolute, played 2 songs. First, Mr. Tambourine Man, perhaps a nod to the song the Byrds had electrified, reclaiming it in its original acoustic form, a reminder of the poetry beneath the electric storm, maybe even a peace offering. And then, a song that felt like both a farewell and a final poignant statement to the folk movement that had nurtured and now rejected him. "It's all over now, baby blue." The closing lines, "Strike another match, go start anew, and it's all over now, baby blue," resonated with an almost unbearable finality. He had crossed the Rubicon. The folk world, his old world, was now baby blue. The immediate aftermath was explosive. The folk press was filled with furious debates. Sing Out magazine published an open letter by Ewan McCall condemning Dylan as a sellout. Fans wrote impassioned letters, some defending his artistic freedom, many accusing him of betraying the cause. Mainstream publications like Time magazine reported on the controversy, amplifying its significance. Dylan, for his part, became increasingly sarcastic and confrontational in press conferences, refusing to be pinned down, mocking the very idea that he was anyone's spokesman. "I'm not a folk singer," he famously declared. "I just sing songs." He took his electric revolution on the road. Backed by the Hawks, later known as the Band, Dylan embarked on a world tour in 1966 that became legendary for its nightly confrontations. In city after city, particularly in the UK, audiences were divided. The first half of the show was acoustic, met with reverence. The second half was electric, met with boos, catcalls, slow hand claps, and walkouts. Dylan responded by pushing the band to play louder, faster, angrier. The tour culminated in the famous incident at the Manchester Free Trade Hall in May 1966, where an audience member shouted, "Judas!" Dylan's response was venomous. "I don't believe you. You're a liar." He then turned to the band and snarled, "Play it fucking loud," before launching into a ferocious version of Like a Rolling Stone. This wasn't just a performance. It was a battle for the soul of the music. But Dylan's defiant stand had opened the floodgates. His move, combined with the success of the Byrds' cover of Mr. Tambourine Man, which hit #1 just before Newport, signaled the birth of folk rock as a dominant commercial force. Suddenly, electric guitars and drums were being added to folk songs everywhere. Simon and Garfunkel's career was resurrected when Tom Wilson overdubbed electric instruments onto The Sound of Silence. Bands like The Lovin' Spoonful, Do You Believe in Magic, The Mamas and the Papas, California Dreamin', Buffalo Springfield featuring Stephen, Stills, and Neil Young, and countless others fused folk harmonies and lyrical depth with rock rhythms. Within a year, the earnest, acoustic folk revival that had dominated the early 60s was effectively over, absorbed and transformed by the electric tide Dylan had unleashed. Looking back, the Newport incident is now viewed not as a betrayal, but as a necessary, revolutionary act. It was the moment popular music grew up. Dylan forced the folk movement to confront its own nostalgic purity and embrace the complex, often contradictory, energy of the times. He proved that electric music could be intelligent, poetic, and politically charged. He bridged the gap between the literary tradition of folk and the visceral power of rock, creating a hybrid sound that would dominate the next decade and beyond. Even Pete Seeger, the alleged axe-wielding purist, eventually softened his stance. He later expressed regret over his initial reaction, acknowledging Dylan's artistic right to evolve, though he maintained his dislike for excessive volume that obscured the lyrics. The anger faded, replaced by an understanding that Dylan's betrayal was actually an act of liberation, freeing music from restrictive definitions. Dylan's legacy from that single, chaotic 15-minute set is immense. He demonstrated that an artist must follow their own muse, regardless of audience expectations or political labels. He showed that true rebellion sometimes means turning against your own followers. He brought a new level of lyrical sophistication and poetic ambiguity to rock and roll, paving the way for artists like the Beatles, particularly in their Rubber Soul and Revolver period, the Rolling Stones, and countless others to explore more complex themes and sounds. The betrayal at Newport wasn't the day folk music died. It was the day it was dragged, kicking and screaming, into the modern world. It was the day it was forced to shed its nostalgic skin and confront the electric chaos of the present. It was the sound of the future arriving, loud, distorted, and utterly undeniable, whether the past was ready for it or not. It was, in its own way, a hard rain falling on the pristine lawn of folk purity, washing away the old order and clearing the ground for something new, something vital, something that still echoes today.